Welcome back to my channel. This is the third episode of the Makeup of Cults, and I'm your host, Bree Hamilton, a religious trauma and deconstruction coach. And I am actually recording this for the second time because the first time it did not save to my computer. As soon as I clicked end, it told me that it was 0 minutes and 0 seconds. So we're taking take two. And hopefully this is going to work. But today we are going to be talking about the story of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians at the Waco, Texas compound called Mount Carmel. So this is the story of a man who called himself the Lamb of God and a community that kind of burned to the ground under his leadership, and we'll get more into that. So there was a siege that lasted 51 days and a compound of folks who, believed in Christian values. They believed in David. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of weapons. And I feel like I could get past all of the faith and fear things, but the weapons are the definite big red flag to me. And then there was a fire that changed how America sees religious extremism really forever, because people are still talking about this to this day, and there are so many conspiracy theories. There are so many conflicting viewpoints. This is a very interesting story. And I just want to note that I am standing up, so my background, everything is a little bit different today because I'm usually sitting down a little bit more to the left. It is what it is. I put my back out on Sunday, and so I can't sit for long periods of time right now. It is starting to get better though. So, also that I will be kind of looking at the camera and then away from the camera because I've got notes and I've also got a mirror to put my makeup on. I will not be specifically letting you know what I'm using each time. I'm probably going to try and just recreate what I just did. We'll see how it goes. But other than that, let's get into today's story. Oh, and I will be putting all of the relevant links, anything I'm talking about, and all of the makeup products into the description below. So if you have any questions about that, that's where it will all be. All right, so Waco, Texas, right? This was the spring of 1993, so I think I was 6 or 7 at the time of this story. So I didn't really know about it when it was happening, because obviously I was pretty young at the time, but definitely learned about it later on as an adult, and then really dove into it in the last little bit, watching a lot of documentaries, listening to a lot of podcasts. So I've probably covered hours of content. So yeah, like I said, this is the spring of 1993, and it was on this property. It was known locally as Mount Carmel. I don't know if it was always called Mount Carmel or if they specifically named it that. I kind of feel like they did because it's very biblical. I had that question, then I forgot to check into it. So it doesn't really matter to the story really who named it that. That's what it was called. But yeah, so Mount Carmel, and it was this really weird sprawling property with kind of buildings in different places and gates and stuff like that. So more than 80 people were behind the locked gates during this time. So there's more than 80 people living there. And they were kind of all under the control of the one man running the show there, whose name was David Koresh. And so, to the outside world, especially to the government at this time, he seemed like a dangerous cult leader who was literally just stockpiling guns, which hello, huge red flag. But to his followers, he was considered the final prophet. He was anointed by God to unlock the secrets of the end times. And this is really how it all began and how it all ended, but I really want to take us back to David's early life and how he kind of became David Koresh, because he actually was not born David Koresh. All right, so the early life of someone named Vernon Howell. So he was born Vernon Wayne Howell in Houston, Texas in 1959. Okay, so a minute ago. Don't hate me, Mom and Dad. I'm not saying you're old. So he was born in 1959 in Houston, Texas. His birth name was Vernon Wayne Howell. And his childhood was pretty fractured. Like, he never actually even knew his bio dad. And his mom was only 14 when he was born. So, like, I mean, she was a kid. She was a baby still, right? She was still figuring out life and whatnot. Like, really not prepared to be a mom at 14. But then, so she ended up marrying someone who became David's stepfather. And he was very abusive to David. So, I mean, he didn't feel loved or accepted or wanted in his home life. And then on top of that, he suffered with dyslexia. So, and of course, just thinking about the time that this happened in, right? Like, nobody was making IEPs and stuff to help support kids with dyslexia, or like more resources or different support systems or whatever, right? So, I mean, he just struggled with dyslexia and he ended up just dropping out of school in grade 11. So, like, all of that culminated in like really rough childhood, rough school and education, right? And so he dropped out of high school, and then he ended up becoming deeply involved in the SDA, or the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So Seventh-day Adventists, if you want to know like more about all of that and what that religion looks like and all of the problems there, go follow my friend Melissa Duke Spears. She is at the Glory Hole on Instagram. I will put her link in the description. She covers a lot of SDA stuff, but they are kind of like evangelical adjacent. But so even in the SDA church, which is very like, there's a lot of stuff to unpack there, but yeah, there's a lot of rules and rigidity and apocalyptic-y stuff. But he still didn't fit in there. He just didn't quite fit in. And so he ended up being expelled from that church because he actually told the pastor that God wanted him to father a child with this pastor's 14-year-old daughter. Well, actually, I don't know if she was 14, but she was a teenager. And so you'll see this pattern kind of repeating itself throughout this story. He really sees himself as this chosen person who is entitled to this control. And it really becomes like a defining feature for David Koresh. So then David ends up joining the Branch Davidians. So he started out in the SDA church, and there was, decades earlier, there had been a break off from the SDA church known as the Davidians, and then the Branch Davidians were a further fracture from that group. So kind of makes you wonder, like, what were the theological or doctrinal or differing opinions that led to all of that. I didn't look into all this because honestly it didn't really matter so much to the story how he ended up there and like what led their version of Christianity to end up there. But you know, I'm interested, and I probably will still look into it later because I'm just curious. But yeah, so he ended up with the Branch Davidians, and I mean, I just think the Seventh-day Adventist folk are like culty and problematic enough. Don't come for me, SDAs, okay? But yeah, as a person who has deconstructed from Christianity in general and overall, like, I'm just like, okay, so like these further cults are obviously very problematic, right? So, the group really believed in like living apart from society to kind of prepare for the coming apocalypse that they believed was coming. So obviously they were very much like, their belief system revolved around apocalyptic themes, which to me is always a red flag. Like, that's always problematic, because when you're only living with this belief that the world is about to end and that you're not going to be here for long, then like nothing matters. You don't care about being, a proponent of human rights. You don't care about making sure everybody has equal rights. You don't care about anything like that because the world's ending. So none of that would matter. And so when you live like that, it's just, it's really problematic. You can see why. And so they really believed that the apocalypse was imminent. And when he joined, he joined and he was living now at Mount Carmel, he was obsessing about scripture and memorizing entire passages of the book of Revelation. If you don't know, the book of Revelation is the revelation to John, who was an apostle of Jesus, and is a guidebook of what is going to happen at the end of the world when before Jesus returns, and then you all live for hundreds of thousands of years glorifying his name or whatever. Obviously that's just a semi-sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek, quick nutshell of that, but that's what that book is, and he was obsessing about it. And so he started attracting a loyal following. So David Koresh was very charismatic. I mean, he was good at gathering people to him and getting people to like him. That was not difficult for David. And so he started attracting this loyal following of people who were really drawn to that charisma and also his conviction. I mean, this dude believed what he believed strongly. And you just couldn't help but, I could help, but only me now. I'm sure me back in my religious trauma days, you couldn't help but be drawn in by these things. And so I think I need to use my other mirror for this part. By the mid-1980s, so the leader of the Branch Davidians at this time was a woman named Lois Roden. And Lois had a son named George who was kind of around David's age, okay? She was considered the prophetess, okay? So she was considered the spiritual leader in this community. And allegedly it seems like David and Lois were actually having a sexual relationship as well. And so I think he was trying to kind of insert himself to be the natural leader. If he was her husband or partner or whatever, right? Then he would take over when she died because she was elderly. And so her son George did not like this. He did not like David. And then Lois ended up dying. And when that happened, then George and David were kind of engaged in this violent power struggle. And that ended up in a shootout. And so that shootout happened in 1987. So he ended up getting arrested and going to prison awaiting trial. But when the trial happened, the jury ended up being a hung jury. And so they were just deadlocked. They could not make a decision. And so the charges were actually dropped, which is just blows my mind. This dude was charged with attempted murder. He tried to kill George. He used a weapon. He was shooting, and he just walks it off. Okay, well, a lot of things could have been avoided had the justice system, for once actually been a carriage of justice. But it wasn't, because when is it? So the charges were dropped, and after he survived that internal battle, he then took control. He came right back from prison and took over. And he then was the leader of Mount Carmel. So at this time, he declared that God had given him this new name. So it was at this point that Vernon became David Koresh. And if you know anything about biblical names, okay, David obviously is that spiritual lineage from King David in the Bible that was chosen by God through the prophet Samuel to be the king, blah, 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 blah. He was just a shepherd and he became king. Koresh is actually the Hebrew version of Cyrus, and Cyrus was the Persian king who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of Judaic and Christian scriptural and spiritual significance to his name. So it hardly makes me think that God gave it to him, but he definitely chose it for those reasons. Okay, so let's try and recreate what we did earlier, if we can. Okay, so as we know, the Branch Davidians were already like, hey, the apocalypse is coming soon cult. I don't want the black yet. But in this version, I mean, David was obsessed, right? And so he really blended mainstream Christian imagery with the apocalyptic prophecies, but then he also wove in his own revelations, which, like, I don't know about you and your background, but when I was someone that was like in those sorts of environments, you know, charismatic, evangelical people are getting like prophetic words from the Lord, blah, 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 blah. You don't really like question it, right? You don't think that it's not from, you don't wonder if it's actually from God. You take them at face value. And so I assume it was very much the same in this situation where, like, why would they question him, right? Like, at this point, they had all kind of joined arms and agreed that like this guy is this chosen one of God and he has these other revelations. And he believed he was the Lamb of God and that he was the only one who could interpret the 7 seals in Revelation. So those are like the 7 seals that have to be broken and then the apocalypse happens. So that's kind of what triggers the end times. And so he believed he was the only one that could interpret these. So some things that kind of a foreshadowing for later, one of the things his followers were taught is that the U.S. government would soon turn against them. And so remember that. Like, he was telling them this beforehand, like when he took over. And then only complete submission to him could actually save their souls. So again, this goes back to all of those problematic red flag trigger things when it comes to cults and religious environments like this. When one person has like made themselves in charge of what happens to your soul and you believe so strongly in that, you are going to fall into line, whether you want to or not. And then the final thing was that he had the divine right to take multiple wives, including teenage girls. And I mean, disgusting. Can we just all, yes, agree? Okay, disgusting. So he ended up claiming at least a dozen wives, and some of them were as young as 14. Which, like, this just makes me think, like, that there was something from his childhood with having a 14-year-old mom that, like, this was, like, a trauma cycle or something. I don't know. But former members that eventually left and testified later, they testified to things like physical beating, sexual coercion, constant psychological control. Like, can you imagine just like living like that all the time? No wonder they left. Unfortunately, more of them did not. So then at that time, he also started stockpiling weapons, okay? He said it was for protection, but obviously federal agents were increasingly seeing this as a sign of impending violence. So you might be asking, how did the federal agents know that he was stockpiling weapons, right? Well, we'll get to that in a bit, but there were people in town that had seen evidence like that were delivering this stuff to the compound and had seen stuff coming out of the boxes, or like the boxes got opened or something fell out. But anyway, people outside of the cult community had seen evidence and had like alerted authorities, okay? So like they were aware. And like, I'm just doing this without talking because we all know I'm gonna make some weird freaking faces and lose my train of thought, so we might as well do this and then jump back into things. So in the early 1990s, the ATF began investigating Mount Carmel. Okay, the ATF is a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, okay? So they're the folks who look into things when weaponry, especially at that level, is a thing. So they start doing their investigation in the early 90s. And so again, like I was saying earlier, UPS was delivering these packages, and they had seen like grenade casings and gun parts being delivered to the compound, and they were like, gun parts for automatic weapons. Okay, so like, what do you need automatic weapons for? What do you need that many automatic weapons for if you're just trying to protect yourself if anything happens? Like, but again, they believe so strongly in this apocalypse theory that like there was no middle ground. There was no, there's no, it was like balls to the wall situation. And so at the same time, former members also shared stories of child abuse and automatic weapons. So like they were getting a lot of corroborative story. And so because of that, then in February 1993, they were able to obtain a search warrant and an arrest warrant for Koresh. So they had a lot of, in order to have those things, like they had a lot of probable cause. They were able to prove a lot of probable cause. So then the agents planned a surprise raid, okay? They were planning the surprise raid so they could seize weapons from him and arrest him. Like, they did not want this shit getting any more dangerous for the people inside, but also the people that lived nearby, right? So, yeah, they were like, they're a little worried. So, fast forward to what kind of all goes down, okay? So Koresh had informants in town, and unfortunately a news crew had been tipped off about the raid happening, and they actually stopped and asked someone for directions to Mount Carmel, and then a local mail carrier overheard them. And unfortunately, this local mail carrier, was David Koresh's brother-in-law. Of course. Why wouldn't he be? So Koresh ends up getting tipped off that a whole bunch of ATF agents are on their way to raid and to arrest him. So obviously he, forms ranks. So yeah, before the agents even have a chance to get there, everyone is aware of what's about to happen. And if you remember, one of the things that David prophesied about was that the U.S. government was out to get them, right? And so now he has proof that even though you can make an argument for all these actions led to this happening, he also now has this proof to stand on that hey, my revelation is coming true. I told you that this would happen and it's happening, right? Ugh. So, unfortunately. So, just before 9:30 a.m., more than 70 ATF agents were approaching Mount Carmel. Now, if you remember back to the beginning, what I said was there were more than 80 folks behind the gates. So, the amount of ATF agents was, almost matching the amount of people behind closed doors. And now remember, this isn't just David Koresh and some dudes with guns, okay? There are moms, dads, kids, all sorts of people are behind the gates of this compound. So, there's a lot of people that are in danger if this goes badly, right? And unfortunately, spoiler, it does not go well. So, some of the agents were in cattle trailers because remember, originally this is supposed to be a surprise, right? So they were trying to still maintain this element of surprise. So Koresh actually came out the front door and he told them hey, I need a moment to gather everyone. But then moments later, gunfire erupted. And so there is a lot of controversy about who fired first. Who started the fight. It's just makes me think of siblings, she's doing it. Yeah, so that happened. Somebody shot. Now the FBI, the ATF say that they were ambushed by folks from the Branch Davidians. Survivors of the Branch Davidian cult say that the agents fired on them unprovoked. Nobody to this day, actually knows the truth of like what actually happened, who fired first, what started it all. I did watch a documentary called American Apocalypse on Netflix about this, and there was some like agents that are now retired that were saying like potentially like it could have been some of the younger agents that were just like nervous and, you know, maybe their fingers slipped, like who knows, right? Anything could have happened. But there's controversy. So this shootout ended up lasting nearly 2 hours, which like, that's tiring. Imagine like just shooting back and forth at each other for 2 hours. That seems very tiring to me. And just like Bailey Sarian, I pretty much can't have a concealer. So here we go. So the outcome of all of that was that there were 4 ATF agents that were killed and 16 of them were wounded. And then 5 of the Branch Davidian members died on the inside. So, and again, like there's no knowing what actually happened. Like, did those Branch Davidian members, were they trying to leave? And David was like, hell no. Did they actually get shot by agents? Like, who freaking knows, right? So many questions, a lot more questions than answers sometimes in these cases. Okay, so after the failed raid, at that point, the FBI was like, all right, like, we're taking over here, my dudes. Good job, but terrible job. So the FBI started doing negotiations. So they had a whole like negotiation center set up, a phone that was calling the compound to talk to David, the whole 9 yards, right? So that was happening. Now Koresh would kind of insist that he was waiting for God's command to surrender. Like, oh, I have to wait for God to tell me that it's the right time. Mm-hmm. Okay, my dude. Whatever you say. I think we can all agree that like he wasn't waiting for God. He had no intention of ever surrendering. Like this guy really did not intend to surrender. And the FBI tried many different tactics. You know, they would cut power to the compound. They would play loud music and even the sound of rabbits dying, which is an absolutely horrendous sound. And so they used it as, what do they call that? Like audio terrorism? I don't know, but this sounds horrible. And I don't think that they should have been doing this, especially with kids inside. But they were trying to pressure the group, right? So they were using anything that they could. They also broadcast messages from Koresh's mom, which I found interesting. Because at this point, I don't think he had like much of a relationship with her, but you know, your mom's your mom. So maybe they were just, like I said, they were trying whatever they could. So with all that being said, there was sort of this, I guess the perspective of David was like that he was unpredictable. Like one day he would seem very willing to negotiate. He would let a couple of kids like go to the local children's aid place or whatever. And then the next day he would just like spend hours quoting scripture on the phone or telling them that he was working on writing his revelation, whatever the fuck that means. That was what it was like negotiating with David Koresh. And so it was kind of like, which David are we going to get today? Is he going to be reasonable today? Are we going to get to save some kids, some people? Or is he just going to be delusional? And so this all led up to April 19th. So after 51 days, the Attorney General, Janet Reno, she authorized a final plan because they were just like, dude, we got to get those kids out of there. I'm not sure that this was the way to do that. But this is what they did. This is what they did. Whether it be the right or wrong thing, can't change that now. This is what happened. So she authorizes this final assault. So FBI tanks are inserting tear gas into the building. And Koresh is just telling negotiators, like, it doesn't matter what y'all do. We're not coming out. Like, we're staying right here. This is where God wants us to be. And so around noon, fire broke out in multiple locations at the same time. So again, this is another controversial thing, but what it seems like happened to me reminds me a lot of the Jonestown massacre or group suicide, whatever you want to call it. So what happened in Jonestown, right, was everyone just like, they believed so strongly in this thing, they were all willing to just die and go to heaven. And so they all drank the Kool-Aid, right? Well, it seems to me like something similar might have happened here, at least with the adults. The kids obviously had no control over the situation, no choice in the matters. But it seems like they set charges in different places and then they were on timers or something and they set them all off at the same time, because FBI footage actually shows flames just erupting simultaneously. And like within minutes, the entire building was like a blazing inferno. So there were a few survivors that escaped through some windows or tunnels, but for the most part, many of these people inside did not escape, did not survive. And so when it was all said and done, there were 76 Branch Davidians that died, including David Koresh, and 25 kids. So it was really sad. And I can just imagine, like, there were a lot of family members that were kind of there at this time and like watching this all happen. So like, if you can just imagine, like, you as a mom, your adult kid and your grandkids are in there and like you don't know if they got out or not. Like, I can just imagine the horrendousness of that scenario, you know? That's just horrible. So in the aftermath of all of this and kind of the legacy that this has left behind, I mean, we all, many of us have heard about the Waco siege, and I don't know if I have lip liner anymore. All right, y'all, we are finally, third episode in, we're going to try to do lashes here, okay? So we are using the BB Lash Melt Cosmetics, and Bailey Sarian did a thing together, so let's put these on, baby. We are first going to make sure they're the right size. So like I said, the Waco siege is something many people have known for a long time and have talked about. There's a lot of controversies and conspiracies about it, but ultimately, I mean, a lot of people died, and there were a lot of kids that died, right? And it's really become a controversial, like, thing about law enforcement operations in the U.S. And I mean, the Justice Department ended up just concluding that the Branch Davidians set the fire themselves. But there's a lot of conspiracy theories about that. And obviously, it kind of like, this kind of a tragedy really radicalizes segments of the militia movement. So this is like an unfortunate sort of post outcome. But Timothy McVeigh actually visited Waco during the siege, and he later credited this whole situation. He cited this as a key motivation for bombing the Oklahoma City Federal Building in '95. So that was really sad for me to like learn about that. I'm not loving this glue at all. Alright. Let's try again. Like I said, you guys are just with me on this journey today, so it is what it is. Let's try this one. I don't like that one's so white. So anyway, yeah, that was like a really sad outcome, learning about that. And just, you know, what makes this story especially heartbreaking is how ordinary people really can end up in these situations that are so extreme. You know, just like Lori Vallow, just like Ruby Franke, like, these people seem like completely normal people until they just weren't. And it's like, how do you get so radicalized, I guess, like so quickly, but it's not really that quick, so I don't know. What do we think? This front corner, I feel like I might have to fix that part later, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And you know, religious trauma can really begin very like gradually and kind of build slowly, you know? So at first there's like that charismatic leadership that it becomes this like unquestioning authority, which we definitely saw in this story, right? And then I hope I'm doing this right. You know, dissent is really reframed as rebellion against God. And so, like, a lot of times it's like, oh, are you questioning God? Even though you're, like, literally questioning a person. And, like, something that they are making allowance for that may or may not even be something from God. Too long on the outer edges, so I might have to cut them off a little bit. Alright, well, that's as good as it's gonna get for this video. So this side definitely feels like it needs a little bit of help, but we will figure that out after. So yeah, so like I said, charismatic leadership become questioning. If you question anything, you're like rebelling against God or questioning God. And isolation from whether it be like family, friends, other people outside, that really normalizes dependence, right? And so, you know, for many who survived, the hardest part wasn't even the fire, but really learning how to trust themselves again after the fact. And I'm sure many of us can kind of relate to that whole like learning to trust ourselves again, trusting the inner voice, trusting that we have wisdom for ourselves that we don't need to look for outside of ourselves and all of that, right? And so, you know, if you recognize these patterns, like so many of us have experienced this, where a leader demanded total allegiance, and a community might have even shamed us into silence, right? And so whenever I am working with folks or even going through my own stuff, I always use my awareness to action method, coaching methodology, right? So that first step is awareness. It's always like really naming what happened and becoming aware of like what led us to where we are at today, right? We don't have to necessarily unpack everything in the backstory, but just being aware of what led us here is helpful. And then accepting, right? And so allowing all of that grief of like, what did we lose by leaving? What did we lose when we stayed? And from where we are today, being able to grieve all of that stuff and heal it is kind of, you know, that first sort of forward step. And then authenticity is really noticing that like you don't have to hide who you are anymore. You are now out of that and you get to be whoever you are. And then any of those ancestral healing, inner child healing pieces, right? Like what was a pattern in your family, a cycle that you're not going to keep repeating, that you're going to stop in its tracks, right? And action is that daily choice to really reclaim that autonomy and rebuild your life on your terms. And so I just want to thank you guys so much for being here today. Thank you so much for joining in and listening to this story. I would love to hear in the comments, like, what thoughts and conspiracy theories and opinions do you have about this story? You know, was the government, did they really have the rights to go in and do this? Should they have waited? Do you think that, like, if they had not gone in, if the Branch Davidians would have just like lived out their lives peacefully? What do you think? I would love to hear it, even if it's different from my opinion, my thoughts. Please share it with me. I'd love to hear it, respectfully. Don't be an asshole. And if you would like to hear a specific story, drop it in the comments, drop any questions, any of that. We all deserve safety and clarity and community. And if you are navigating your own journey after high control religion, that's what I hold space for. So as a trauma deconstruction coach, for folks healing from religious trauma, I have a 6-month group coaching program starting in September. So that is for folks who like really want to rebuild that community. So we're not only rebuilding that online community, but helping you to really support yourself to do that in your personal life as well, right? Geographically. And so there's a mixture of like community focused group coaching, one-on-one coaching, just like a ton of high touch, high intentionality for that space. And so that's going to be $200 a month for 6 months from September to March. And so if that is something that is calling to you, I would absolutely love to hear from you. You can hit me up on Instagram, or you can just fill out the interest form and I will, see where you're at. And then we can just see if it's like the right aligned next step for you. Other than that, feel free to hit the like and subscribe buttons. That really just helps push this out to more people. I would love to be able to do some YouTube live streaming on here. So more followers means that is more of a reality for me. And I just want more awareness of like religious trauma and healing and all these things, right? So I would love to hear from you in the comments, but until next time, I will see you in the next video. Bye.